When the Second World War ended, Germany's fields were as broken as its cities. In 1945, agriculture in the Eastern Zone, soon to become the German Democratic Republic, was the foundation on which everything else had to be rebuilt. Before the war, Germany's countryside was modern by European standards: efficient estates, mechanized farms, high yields, and a skilled rural workforce. The East, especially Saxony and Brandenburg, had been known for large-scale production, not peasant farming. But in the ashes of 1945, ideology replaced economics. The Soviets and their German communists saw agriculture not as a sector, but as a battlefield. The first reform of socialist Germany wasn't about factories or coal, it was about soil. The Bodenreform, land reform, confiscated every estate larger than 100 hectares. Roughly 40% of all farmland was seized, often overnight. About 7,000 large landowners were expropriated. Some were imprisoned or deported east. Their land was divided among over 200,000 new farmers, many of them refugees or loyal party members. It was meant to destroy the old elite and create a class of socialist peasants. On paper, it looked like justice. In reality, it was economic disaster. Most new farmers lacked tools, livestock, or even roofs over their heads. Of 37,000 planned new farmhouses, only 748 were ever completed by 1948. Machinery had been stripped for reparations, fertilizer was scarce, entire regions farmed with hand plows. Within 5 years, 1 in 3 of the new farmers had given up. But ideology doesn't retreat easily. In 1952, the next step arrived: collectivization. Private farming was declared bourgeois, and farmers who still owned more than 20 hectares were labeled class enemies. Delivery quotas rose to impossible levels. Food prices were fixed far below production costs. Many were driven into ruin. Some were jailed. Others were publicly shamed in village meetings. In theory, the collective farms, the LPGs or Landwirtschaftliche Produktionsgenossenschaften, would pool labor and resources to create efficiency. In practice, they replaced skill with loyalty. Between 1952 and 1960, around 40,000 farmers and their families fled to West Germany, representing nearly 1/5 of the GDR's pre-war independent farming population. By 1960, over 80% of all farmland was collectivized, but the people who worked it had no motivation to care. A joke spread: they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. The Stasi even coined a term for it: the work slowly ideology. The numbers tell the story. Crop yields dropped by double digits compared to the late 1940s, and by the early 1960s, East German agriculture was producing less per hectare than before the war, despite 3 times as many bureaucrats overseeing it. Yet, the regime didn't see failure. It saw inefficiency to be corrected with more socialism. In the 1970s, the state introduced the Cooperative Abteilung Pflanzenproduktion, massive agricultural combines spanning up to 5,000 hectares, modeled on industrial production. Crop and livestock divisions were split, managed like separate factories. In theory, it was modernization. In reality, it created 2 bureaucracies competing for the same fuel, feed, and workers. The manure from livestock farms piled up unused. Crop farms lacked fertilizer. The system was vast but hollow. Still, not everything was failure. The GDR achieved near-universal mechanization by the late 1970s, more tractors per hectare than West Germany. Animal production, heavily subsidized, reached record levels in pork and poultry. Some LPGs became genuine community centers, offering daycare, medical care, and cultural programs in rural areas. But the success was structural, not economic. It required massive subsidies to survive. In 1985, agriculture still employed 10.8% of East Germany's labor force and consumed 7.4% of total capital investment, yet contributed only 8.1% to national output. Compare that to West Germany, where barely 4% of workers produced twice the food. Behind the statistics was fatigue. Fields went unharvested, equipment broke and stayed broken, and the paradox deepened. The collective farms underperformed, but the tiny private garden plots, just 3% of total farmland, produced more than a quarter of the country's vegetables, fruit, and milk. The regime's quiet dependence on these private plots was one of socialism's great unspoken contradictions. Even the Stasi reports revealed the disillusionment. One officer wrote in 1961, shortly after the wall was built, "Since the border is closed, you don't hear anyone complain anymore. Everyone just works quietly." By the 1980s, the gap between propaganda and reality was impossible to hide. Official newsreels showed bumper harvests, shining tractors, and contented farmers. But in cities, queues for meat stretched around corners. The GDR imported grain from the West, the same capitalist countries it condemned. Bread and canned goods were rationed. Fresh produce was seasonal and unreliable. Still, the ideology endured. East German agriculture had become what socialism itself was: centralized, disciplined, full of ambition, and slowly eroding from within. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the agricultural system collapsed with it. The collectives and state farms dissolved almost overnight. Within 2 years, more than half of all rural workers lost their jobs. Land was sold, privatized, or abandoned. Some of the old LPGs reinvented themselves as modern cooperatives. Ironically, a handful became some of the most efficient agribusinesses in unified Germany. But most disappeared, leaving behind miles of empty barns and broken machinery. The fate of East German agriculture mirrors the fate of the state itself. It began as a revolutionary experiment to build equality from the ground up, and ended buried under the same ground it once promised to liberate. In the end, the DDR tried to reshape the countryside into an image of socialism: collective, efficient, and eternal. But the soil, like the people, refused to be engineered.